Elderly wee veterans who still fought in WTI by the time WTI rolled around. There was a whole new generation who could be conscripted into the military. But there was also a host of older men who had survived WTI 21 years early. 3 WTI veterans in particular stood out for their tenacity and audacious actions. 1. Walter Ernest Wally Brown, aged 56 during YYI. Wally climbed the ranks to become a sergeant in the Australian Imperial Force, enlisting at the age of 30 in 1915 and traveling from Australia to Egypt. Wally soon switched from infantry to cavalry to more quickly see battle. He faked an excuse of having lost his fake teeth to be sent to the capital, Cairo, and from there transferred to the Western Front. Then, during the 1917 Battle of Passchendaele, when Wally's sergeant fell in the fight, he quickly took charge, leading the troops and storming in himself to rescue the wounded. Despite the hail of bullets and grenades exploding around him, his actions earned him the Distinguished Conduct Medal. A year later, though, he outdid himself. At the Somme, a notorious battle site of YGY, and under threat of heavy machine gun fire and sniper attacks, he dashed toward an enemy post. Wally, who had nerves of steel, stood in front of the dugout demanding the enemy surrender. After a short fist fight, 11 soldiers of varying ranks and an officer accompanied him back to the Allied lines under heavy gunfire as prisoners. He was later awarded the Victoria Cross for his action. Despite Wally's heroism and clear love for battle, he was discharged from the army in 1920. However, when WD2 broke out in 1939, he was determined to return to the front lines, despite being 54 years old. He lied, giving his date of birth as 1900 to be eligible for service. While he was eventually discovered and promoted, he chose to instead revert to gunner. Wally's life ended in Singapore in 1942. In February 1942, as the Allies were about to surrender, he reportedly picked up a few grenades, turned to his comrades, and said his last known words, "No surrender for me." He walked toward enemy lines, never to be seen again. Despite being too old to even be there in the first place, Wally seemed determined to die on the front lines, epitomizing the phrase, "I was born as a soldier, and I will die as one." Number 2, Adrien Carton de Villiers, aged 65 de Villiers, is a prime example of someone who just refused to die. Already having fought in the Boer War, he was 34 by the time the First World War rolled around, and he didn't have a particularly lucky time of it on YYC's front lines. First in Somaliland in 1914, de Villiers was wounded in the elbow, ear, and eye. But this didn't deter him at all, as he immediately charged right back into the fray, promptly taking a bullet ricochet to the same eye, resulting in its eventual loss. This might have been enough for some, but all de Villiers had to say was that it had been the most exhilarating fun. A year later, at the Battle of Ypres, de Villiers also experienced the effects of shelling, before having his hand literally blown apart. He spent the rest of 1915 with doctors, fruitlessly trying to save the damaged appendage, before he demanded it was amputated instead. He called the amputation no worse than having a tooth out. At La Boichelle, in France, 1916, de Villiers was back on the front line. He was later awarded the Victoria Cross for controlling the other battalions after their commanders fell, and exposing himself fearlessly to enemy fire, something he doesn't even consider worthy of note in his memoir. Still, one hand and eye down, de Villiers went on to become the youngest brigadier general in the Allies, but his streak of bad luck wasn't over. Before the end of the war in 1918, de Villiers managed to fit in a good few more injuries, including a shrapnel-hit ear and then nearly losing his leg when posted to the Bantam Division. Despite all that, he still made it back to France for the end of the year, and in his memoir uttered the now famous line, despite his age, which was mature even at the start of the First World War, de Wiart seemed to have a genuine love of battle. That didn't change across the decades of his life. A few years after the war, de Wiart left the military and spent 20 years in Poland. But before World War II broke out, he asked to be reinstated and was appointed to head the British military mission to Poland. He was now 59. In his memoir, de Wiart doesn't acknowledge his own age, instead focusing on what the new technologies invented in the last 20 years meant for the face of battle. Its glory shone, no longer the soldiers setting forth into battle, but the women and children buried under it. During World War II, he kept up his streak of refusing to die, first surviving a plane crash, then finding himself captured by the Italians and placed in a prisoner of war camp in Vincigilata. In 1943, he tunneled his way from the camp with others, escaping only to be caught 8 days later and over 100 miles away, an impressive feat given his appearance and lack of Italian. At the time, de Wiart proudly states both his and his escape partners' combined ages were 116. Although clearly invented nothing to slow them down. After being sent back to the British as a token of good faith, de Wiart retook his place in the military, flying to China, where he somehow was involved in yet another plane crash, yet again escaping largely uninjured. Remarkably, that seemed to be the last bit of bad luck de Wiart had during the war. After the war, however, he still managed to later slip and fall down a flight of stairs in Burma, cranking his back. He, of course, made a full recovery. George S. Patton, aged 60. George Patton, the famous American general of World War II, made a name for himself as an aggressive and tenacious commander who was fully of the belief in war, nothing is impossible, providing you use audacity. It was this attitude that earned him the nickname Old Blood and Guts. Before that, however, he served in the Tank Corps during World War I, age 32, where he studied tanks and advocated for full frontal attacks. In World War II, Patton's fame grew as he rose to the rank of general and played crucial roles in the D-Day landings and the Battle of the Bulge. He very much believed in the phrase, "We shall attack and attack until we are exhausted, and then attack again." The type of leader Patton was clear, but despite his success, he evidently wasn't the nicest of men, as shown by his behavior during the 1943 slapping incidents. The aggressive general was visiting Italian war hospitals when he came across 27-year-old rifleman Charles Cool, suffering from battle fatigue, now known as PTSD. Told the general, "I guess I just can't take it." Rather than understanding or acknowledging in Patton's own words, he slapped him across the face with my glove, told him to get up and make a man out of himself. Patton later wrote in his diary, had other officers had the courage to do likewise, the shameful use of battle fatigue as an excuse for cowardice would have been infinitely reduced. While battle fatigue wasn't fully understood at the time, many still saw Patton's actions as outrageous treatment of a young invalid man. Days later, Patton repeated his abuse to another young man named Bennett, slapping him multiple times and yelling at him, calling him a coward and threatening to shoot him himself. His reprehensible behavior may have been overlooked in favor of his military might, but word spread. Eisenhower made him apologize for his actions, fearful he would be forced to retire the general that would, in his opinion, win them the war. The interim years between World War I and II only served to harden Patton into a highly effective but aggressive and sometimes plain nasty man. He remained confident in his own abilities above all others, stating, It is my opinion that if the war ceased at that moment, the troops under my command would have had the best and most successful campaign in history. I am still of that opinion. Nikolai Morozov, the oldest World War II soldier who died aged 92 in 1946. When, at the age of 87, Nikolai Morozov picked up a rifle to fight the Germans, he became the oldest combatant of World War II. In the winter of 1942, Morozov volunteered to help break the siege of Leningrad that had lasted for more than a year. Nikolai Morozov was born on July 7, 1854, on the Boryk estate in the Yaroslavl province, as an illegitimate son of Pyotr Shepelkin, a Russian landowner, and a servant girl. Being an illegitimate child, Nikolai bore the surname of his mother. Even so, he enjoyed all the privileges of his father's family, primarily regarding his education. As a youngster, Morozov was sent to the Second Moscow Gymnasium, one of the capital's elite schools. While he was there, Nikolai showed signs of being a rebellious young man. He objected to the classical curriculum he attended for its lack of natural science studies. In protest, he helped organize the secret student group, the Society of Naturalists. Nikolai's beliefs, in contrast to the ideas of the old Russia, led him to abandon his studies and completely break off all ties with his family. In early 1874, he gave all of his belongings away and joined the Society of the Circle of Tchaikovsky, the forerunners of the 1917 Russian Revolution. In order to join this radical society, Morozov had to study hard and spread the idea of revolution among the people. It was because of these activities that Morozov had to leave Russia for Switzerland. While he was in exile, Nikolai Morozov became an even more ardent revolutionary, as he became captivated by the works of Karl Marx, who he eventually met a couple of times in later years. He became a journalist, writing articles in workers' newspapers, and was also a member of the Geneva section of the First International. His activities in Switzerland had also brought him to the attention of the Russian authorities, and he was put on their list of wanted criminals. In March of 1875, Morozov was arrested and imprisoned while attempting to enter Russia on suspicion of revolutionary activity. 3 years later, the 193 trial took place, and he was acquitted. After he was released from prison for the first time, Nikolai Morozov continued his revolutionary work with the organization The People's Will. By spreading subversive propaganda to achieve the goals of the revolution. Once again, his political activities brought him to the attention of the authorities, and in 1881 he was arrested and tried at the famous process of 20 trial. The court sentenced him to indefinite hard labor. Morozov was sent to the Peter and Paul Fortress prison in St. Petersburg, from where he was then transferred to the dungeons of the Shishilberg Fortress. During his 25 years of imprisonment, Nikolai's health began to deteriorate, but he managed to broaden his knowledge of languages and natural sciences, such as physics, chemistry, astronomy, and history. In 1905, Nikolai Morozov and several of his comrades were released from prison under a political amnesty that followed the 1905 revolution. Upon his release, he continued to teach natural sciences at the University of St. Petersburg, where he was able to create some unusual scientific theories. He was also one of the first Russians to learn to fly a plane in 1910. That same year, he was also imprisoned for one last time, for a year, because of a revolutionary poem he published called Song of the Star. Strangely, after the October Revolution, and when the Soviet state was established, Morozov decided to stay out of politics. He never became a member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Instead, he was appointed director of the Lizev Natural Science Institute in Leningrad. It was a duty he performed for the rest of his life, eventually becoming an honorary member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. When the Great Patriotic War started in the summer of 1941, Morozov was at his family estate in Boryk. He stayed there throughout the entire war, giving refuge to his colleagues from the institute. At one point during the war, though, he went on a business trip that lasted for a whole month. During that time, he didn't have any contact with his friends or family, and his disappearance remained a mystery, even to his biographers. Where did he go? What did he do? Many years later, a story materialized that Morozov had actually been allowed to go and fight on the front line as a Red Army soldier. Morozov was, above everything else, a patriot. When Germany attacked the Soviet Union and soon after appeared at the gates of the city of Leningrad, he felt it was his duty to help defend his country and his fellow Russians inside the besieged city. Morozov had been a revolutionary all of his life and had no problem fighting for his ideals, despite the fact that he was 87 years old. The problem was that the army was not willing to draft old men just yet, even though in 1942 they needed every man available. Every request sent by Morozov was denied by a local enlistment office. Little did they know who they were dealing with. When fed up with being constantly turned down for active service, he threatened to go right to the top and report the matter to Stalin himself. Only then did the enlistment officer give in and allow him to go to the front, but only for a month, just to shut him up. Under the pretext of going on a business trip, Nikolai Morozov was sent to the Volkhov Front. The Volkhov Front was first formed in December 1941 to hold back the advancing German army. It was disbanded in April of 1942, but once again reformed 2 months later as a part of the Leningrad Front. The front participated in operations aiming to break the siege of Leningrad, attacking the German units from the east. Battle-hardened soldiers of the Volkhov Front were shocked to see an old gray-haired man with a beard who had come to join their ranks and fight the Germans. His stature barely allowed him to hold a rifle properly. They were even more surprised when Morozov told the battalion commander that he was 87 years old. The battalion was looking for more fit and agile young snipers who ended up getting this very old man instead. Morozov, however, did his best to convince them that they had gotten the right man for the job. By nature, Morozov was an inquisitive person and didn't allow his advanced years to prevent him from learning new things. In 1939, when he was 85, Morozov enrolled in a Savyakim, or a sniper course. A Savyakim was an abbreviation for the Society for the Assistance of Defense, Aircraft and Chemical Construction, which was a Soviet civil society of volunteers set up to reinforce the army. The society trained civilians in handling weapons, parachuting, and air and chemical defense. In 1941, when the Soviet Union was attacked, the organization had 81,000 trainees in 4,000 groups, over 100 teams, and about 230 detachments. Nikolai Morozov was one of these volunteers. All the skills that he had learned at the Savyakim were put into practice on the front line. He was able to apply the art of science while shooting, taking into consideration the wind speed and direction, and also the air humidity. It soon became apparent that Morozov was very good at killing Nazis. He had at least 10 enemy kills confirmed. Unfortunately for his sniper career, though, the adventure on the front ended after only a month, as he had been told in the beginning. He was deployed to the rear and asked to contribute further to the war effort by continuing his scientific research. It was not enough for Morozov, who kept on insisting being given more opportunities to fight. This time, the army did not give in to his demands. For the rest of the war, Morozov spent his time at his Boruk estate. There is a question of whether the whole story of the oldest soldier of World War II is true or not, or just some propaganda insinuating that all of Mother Russia were fighting together for a common cause. However, after the Leningrad siege was broken, Nikolai Morozov was awarded the Medal for the Defense of Leningrad and the Order of Lenin. So was this something to do with his mysterious business trip on the front line? Nikolai died naturally of old age at his home in Boruk on July 30th, 1946. Aged 92, nearly 1 year after the war ended. The asteroid 1210 Orisikia, a large rock measuring 33 kilometers or 21 miles in diameter, that orbits the Sun between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, is named in his honor, as well as a crater on the Moon. Norman Cota, the old man on the beach, war is for the young, or so conventional wisdom goes. During the Second World War, the average age in the American military was the mid-20s, with those of more advanced years generally excluded from combat roles. There are some, however, who defied this conventional wisdom and served their country regardless of age. This is the story of one of the oldest soldiers on Omaha Beach. Norman Daniel Cota was born on May 30th, 1893, in Chelsea, Massachusetts. He was a student at Worcester Academy, where he was an avid football player. It was during this time he earned the nickname Dutch, though it's unclear where this came from. In 1913, he was accepted to West Point Military Academy and associated with many future high-level officers, including Dwight Eisenhower, with whom he would remain close friends. Due to America's entry into the First World War, Cota's class had their academic terms cut short, and he and the rest of his classmates graduated in April 1917, 2 months ahead of schedule. In spite of the accelerated education, the war ended before Cota could reach the front lines and did not see action in the First World War. He rose through the ranks quickly, being promoted from second lieutenant to first lieutenant to captain to major in 18 months, serving as an instructor at West Point until 1920, though due to downsizing of the military, he was demoted to captain. In 1922, he was the financial officer for Langley Field, Virginia, which was robbed of $43,000, forcing Cota to petition Congress to prevent him from having to pay back the money that he was held responsible for. He served in numerous other posts over the intervening years, and by 1941 was the chief intelligence officer, and later the plans and training officer for the 1st Infantry Division. When the U.S. entered the Second World War, he was promoted to Chief of Staff for the division, serving in that capacity until 1943. In this role, he participated in the North African campaign and was later involved in the planning and execution of Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. In 1944, he was promoted to Brigadier General and was made responsible for training troops for amphibious landings. It was during the Normandy landings that he would make his greatest mark on history. In the lead-up to Operation Overlord, he was again reassigned, this time made the executive officer of the 29th Infantry Division. They, along with his former unit of the 1st Infantry Division, were tasked with assaulting a section of the Normandy coast, codenamed Omaha Beach. Cota had misgivings about the operation, believing that the timing of the dawn landing was too late and that a pre-dawn assault would be more effective, but was overruled by High Command, who stated that air and naval support for the invasion would need daylight to be effective. Cota would join his troops for the landing, and at 51 years old was the second oldest man to land that day, after Theodore Roosevelt Jr. on nearby Utah Beach, who was 56. On June 6, 1944, British, American, and Canadian forces engaged in the largest amphibious operation in history. When the Allied forces hit the beach, they were met with a hail of machine gun, rifle, and mortar fire from the heavily entrenched German positions. The first wave suffered heavy casualties, particularly at Omaha Beach, and the attack stalled out. In the second wave, Cota landed at 7:30 a.m., which was under heavy fire from the Germans, and at least 3 men on his landing craft were killed as they disembarked the craft. What he found there was confusion, with the men of the 29th disordered and floundering on the beach. As the highest-ranking officer, the task of rallying the men and bringing order to chaos fell to Cota. In this decisive moment, he didn't hesitate. With withering gunfire and mortar shells falling around him, The general strode up and down Omaha Beach, seemingly without regard for his safety, rallying his men and leading them forward, coordinating their efforts and bringing much-needed leadership to the beleaguered soldiers. At one point, he came across a group of men hunkered down to avoid enemy fire. "Which unit do you belong to?" he asked the men. One of them replied, "5th Rangers." Cota then bellowed out, "Well then, Rangers, show the way." Though the exact wording of this exchange varies depending on the telling, the phrase, "Rangers lead the way," has been adopted as the official motto of the U.S. Army Rangers. Another quote has been attributed to Cota on that fateful day. Attempting to urge his men, he declared that, "Gentlemen, we are being killed on the beaches. Let's go inland and be killed." While it would be something in Cota's bombastic character to say, it was actually said by Colonel George Taylor of the 1st Infantry Division further down the beach. Under Cota's leadership, the men advanced, scavenging whatever weapons and equipment they could find until they reached a barricade of barbed wire. Under Cota's direction, Bangalore torpedoes, long metal tubes packed with explosives, were placed under the obstruction, then detonated. With the way clear, some of the men rushed forward into the breach, and one was cut down by German machine gun fire. The rest froze and took cover, unwilling to risk attacking this choke point that was clearly being covered by the enemy. Knowing the situation was critical and the men's morale hanging by a thread, once again Cota took decisive action. In spite of the danger, he stood and advanced into the gap, urging the men on. Encouraged by his actions, or perhaps shamed by a man twice their age, the rest of the men followed. They poured off the beach through the opening, and Cota led the men to the village of Verville-sur-Mer. When the last of the column finally reached the town, Cota asked them in his typical bombastic tone, "Where the hell have you been, boys?" In the initial aftermath of the invasion, he continued to be a source of inspiration for his men. On June 7th, he was one of the first to enter the town of Essigny, striding boldly without any fear of German snipers. And on June 11th, stood unflinching at a road junction while under fire, joking with his men to calm their nerves. After leading his men to success on D-Day, Cota was reassigned as commander of the 28th Infantry Division in August 1944. He and the 28th campaigned across France and were selected to represent American forces in the Victory Parade, which celebrated the liberation of Paris. Cota and the 28th participated in the Battle of Hirschen Forest, which began in September 1944. Cota had misgivings about the operational orders he was given. The 28th was sent to advance along 3 separate prongs, which would spread the division thin over 150 miles of frontage. His concerns were disregarded, and during the fighting portions of the 28th were forced to retreat after suffering heavy casualties. While this was partially due to the difficult orders, Cota also made tactical errors of his own, such as not sending out proper reconnaissance of the objectives, and not making full use of the armored forces assigned to him. Out of concern that the terrain was unsuitable for their use. This unfortunate incident is a blemish on what would otherwise be a sterling reputation. After the debacle of Hirschen Forest, he was given an official reprimand, though he was allowed to stay as commander of the 28th, a position which he held for the rest of the war, though his hopes of being promoted to corps commander were dashed forever. After the war, Cota retired from the Army in 1946 and became the Civil Defense Director for Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. He would die on October 4th, 1971, and would be buried at West Point. During his career, Norman Daniel Cota would receive numerous medals, including the Army Distinguished Service Medal, Silver Star Medal with Bronze Oak Leaf Cluster. Legion of Merit with Bronze Oak Leaf Cluster. Bronze Star Medal with Bronze Oak Leaf Cluster. And a Purple Heart. He also received several foreign awards, including the British Distinguished Service Order and the French Croix de Guerre, for his heroic actions on D-Day, rallying and leading the beleaguered men on Omaha Beach. Cota would be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award a soldier can be given for bravery on the battlefield. Cota would also gain another form of immortality. He would be portrayed by actor Robert Mitchum in the 1962 war movie, The Longest Day, who would deliver the final line of this classic piece of cinema. We upload all the videos that we have to censor from YouTube to our Patreon. Right now, you can watch uncensored videos on the Battle of Cantian, medieval warfare, and the Sherman tank all on Patreon. History is epic. Watch it uncensored.